former Yugoslavia is now in session. L'audience du Tribunal Penal International pour l'ex-Yougoslavie est ouverte. Please be seated.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Registrar. Could you call the case, please?
Good morning, Your Honors. Good morning to everyone in and around the courtroom. This is case number IT-0588T, the prosecutor versus Popović et al. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. For the record, all the accused are present. Presentation is full house except for Ms. Popović. Mr. Haynes, your closing arguments, please.
Thank you. I apologise if you can't see me clearly. I'm not sitting back here because the severity of this haircut won't stand too much close scrutiny. We've decided to stay here out of a sort of nostalgia, really. Having sat here for 3 years, we thought we'd finish here. A few months ago, when I opened this case to you, I underlined the themes that had been the Popović defence and would continue to be developed during the presentation of his case. One theme was specifically not addressed, namely that of his character. Neither was it developed in the course of the final brief. However, given the manner in which the prosecution have addressed several issues in their final brief, it seemed to me only appropriate that I remind you of the substantial body of evidence within the case, which place the few matters relied upon by the prosecution into their proper context. The matters I shall refer to in the following section of this closing argument derive entirely from unchallenged oral evidence and the testimony of witnesses admitted under Rule 92 bis without any requirement for their attendance for cross-examination. It can thus, I submit to you, be taken as unchallenged. Vinko Popović was raised in a farming community in a multi-ethnic part of the former Yugoslavia. During his childhood, although aware of the different beliefs of his neighbours and school friends, he was brought up to believe in the principles of brotherhood and unity. It was the practice of his family to interact with their Muslim neighbours on their respective feast days, to respect their beliefs, and to cooperate in practical ways wherever possible. In the submission of the defence, his upbringing and beliefs are of peculiar relevance in his case, informing as they did many of the decisions he was to take during the war in Bosnia. He entered service with the JNA through the military academy against his mother's wishes. It was the only practical solution to the funding of his higher and further education, as his parents had no money. Virtually all of his pre-war service, indeed virtually all of his adult life prior to 1992, was spent in Slovenia, where he settled with his young family and assimilated into local life and culture. There he developed his interest in socialist politics. It was in Slovenia that he first commanded a unit. It was composed entirely of Slovenian conscripts. His commanding officer, Timir Blaškić, a Croat, became his best man or kum. He learnt to speak Slovenian, contributed to local journals and magazines, came to regard the area as his home, and was loved and respected by his friends and colleagues there, as much for his own ethnicity as for his endeavours to blend in locally. In considering his understanding of the situation of the ethnic communities within Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as his own personal beliefs, it is relevant, we submit, to remember that he had spent the 15 years prior to the start of the war outside Bosnia. After the commencement of hostilities in Bosnia, Pandorović was deployed as part of a JNA unit in Visegrad. In spite of the occasional insinuation in this trial by the prosecution about Visegrad, no evidence has been adduced nor any suggestion made which would cloud Pandorović's reputation as a man or a soldier during this period. The defence has adduced evidence, which will be referred to in due course, of actions that speak only of his positive qualities during that period. On the 18th of December 1992, Pandorović arrived in Zvornik to assume command of the Zvornik Brigade. He was a 33-year-old first-class captain. He was very young and very short of experience for such a role, especially given the size of the Zvornik Brigade, both numerically and geographically, which made it such a hard body to control. His effect upon the operative efficiency of the Zvornik Brigade was almost immediate. In truth, it had to be, because it and the region were in a parlous state of security at the end of 1992. Pandorović tried to command the brigade pursuant to the rules and to the structure of the Zvornik Brigade as much as possible in accordance with military principles. He was perceived by his colleagues as a true or real commander. He was strict, but also correct and even-handed, so that other officers respected him and saw him as a real soldier. His strictness was based first of all upon strictness towards himself and then towards others. The discipline in the brigade was different when he was there as opposed to when he was absent. Pandorović treated all his soldiers equally, whether they were professional soldiers or not. As a commander, he showed neither favoritism nor prejudice. Milenko Jevđević recalled a combat situation when Pandorović sent his own brother and his headquarters administration commander, together with Muslim porters who had work obligation, to take ammunition to units at the front. Milenko Jovicic described him more simply. He was just an extremely good person. A phrase from General Krstić's evidence was put to Pandorović in cross-examination, where he was described as the best brigade commander in the Drina Corps, one of the best commanders amongst his peers in the army as a whole, a professional soldier in every sense of the word. He was equally respected by the civilian population in Zvornik. He was viewed as a very capable man of almost unique qualities, whose ability to solve a problem without raising his voice was well known. However, he was certainly not popular with the politicians or anyone in the political leadership in Zvornik municipality. His rating with them was not very good for all sorts of reasons, but mainly because he didn't let them interfere in the command of the Zvornik Brigade, something that they repeatedly tried to do, according to Miodrag Dragutinović. He was, of course, an extremely effective combat soldier. Those who had the opportunity to work together with him in battle had a very high opinion of him as a professional soldier. They saw him as a young officer who, in the most effective way, put the knowledge he had gained in his military schools into practice very well during the war. He had a very high capability in the field of control and command of his units. He was capable of rapid planning, rapid deployment, and rapid implementation of an operation. Moreover, he had the skill to size up a situation, carry out preparations, and go into action in keeping with the situation on the ground, and he acted energetically. The trial chamber has heard at least 3 compelling examples of Pandorović's skills as a commander in battle. These were chronologically Operation Match 1, the taking of Usti Pracha in June of 1993, the retaking of Živkovo Brdo on the morning of the 10th of July of 1995, and the repulsion of the Croatian forces at Grahovo in the Krajina in August of 1995. These military successes were often achieved in spite of the poor quality of the units under his command, or the tactical ineptitude of his neighbouring units. The trial chamber will doubtless have got the impression that whoever he was dealing with, Pandurović was not a man who suffered fools gladly, and moreover, he was never afraid of speaking his mind. The trial chamber may or may not conclude that in describing some of the non-governmental organisations present in Republika Srpska as good-for-nothings, prosecution brief, paragraph 1311, this aspect of Pandurovic's character was well reflected. Nonetheless, throughout the entirety of the war, Pandurovic's relationship with international organisations was constructive and cooperative. His assertion that as a soldier he was primarily interested in peace is credible and borne out by the evidence of his behaviour. His pride in his relationship with General Morion, a witness on his 65 Ter list, in the spring of 1993 was plain. Pandurović complied with the General's requests and ensured free movement and free passage for General Morion while he was carrying out his duties as a UN commander. His orders to the members of his unit as to how to deal with members of the Dutch battalion during Krvaja 95 were entirely proper and completely unchallenged. He was an active participant in the execution of the Dayton Peace Accords between November 1995 and his departure from Zvornik, cooperating both with I4 and the Bosnian Army forces. In spite of his youth and inexperience, Pandurović was neither afraid to question orders which were, in his view, unjustifiable, nor to act on his own initiative. He showed that not just on the 11th of July in Srebrenica and in Bratunac, we maintain, nor just on the 16th of July in Balkovica, but throughout the war, whenever the situation demanded it. The defence invite the trial chamber to view that in the case of Pandurović, actions truly speak louder than words. In the submission of the defence, Pandurovic's actions in July 1995 in standing up to Mladic and contravening his orders to destroy the column were neither isolated nor born of necessity, but were rather the concrete expression of his character and integrity through his actions. To that end, the evidence of Pandurovic's actions prior to the critical events of July 1995 is more than mere character evidence. The types of evidence envisaged as being relevant to culpability in the prior jurisprudence of this tribunal do not fall into this category. In those cases, it amounted to no more than evidence of a lack of prejudice or general good character. The episodes about which this trial chamber has heard during the course of this case relate to
Thank you for slowing down when reading.
intensity and state of mind.
Mr. Haynes, you're being invited to slow down a little bit for the sake of
Thank you very
interpreters,
much.
please.
I
Thank you.
will. The episodes about which this trial chamber has heard during the course of the case relate directly to the question of propensity and state of mind. Where there is an issue, for example, as to the motivation of the accused in letting the column pass at Balkovica, the defence contend that it is relevant to take into account the fact that on prior occasions Pandurović behaved in a precisely similar fashion when neither he nor his forces were at any risk. I'm going to list now just a few of the episodes of Pandurovic's behaviour which we will ask you to take into account in determining his motivation and state of mind in July of 1995. In April of 1992, in Visegrad, Pandurović protected Muslim civilians from Serb paramilitaries, disarming the latter and forcing them to return to Serbia. He also provided food to the Muslim population and pledged to protect them. This may have been a piece of evidence which went unnoticed. It derives from 7D1191, the 92 bis witness statement of Gusho Midhad, and I will read from it. Soldiers of the Uzice Corps of the JNA Yugoslav National Army asked locals to declare arms in their possession. They came up to my house. They did not go inside. One of the soldiers started as if he were to enter the house and began to act in a rough manner. Another soldier then approached him. He did not allow him to go inside, saying, "Act decently, or I will report you to Vinco." When I heard the name Vinco, I did not know who that referred to. I assumed that it was a reference to an officer who does not permit violent and arbitrary conduct towards Muslims. At that time, I did not know Vinko Pandurović. I saw him for the first time 2 or 3 days after the event that I recounted. I note that the unit under Vinko Pandurovic's command had a kitchen at the house of one of my brothers, where it prepared food for the troops. Pursuant to Vinko Pandurovic's order, the food from that military kitchen was distributed also to us, residents from the village. He goes on at paragraph 11 to say, "In view of the circumstances, it is my belief that the members of this paramilitary group would have killed those of us standing around the post office, but for the fact that Vinko Pandurović prevented them from doing so." Shortly after becoming commander of the Zvornik Brigade, Pandurović established contact with the commander of the opposing forces, the ubiquitous Shemso Muminović. They quickly established a hotline. Their contacts led to regular prisoner exchanges, an agreement on the shelling of certain inhabited areas, and an agreement for a ceasefire of sufficient duration to permit each side to sow and reap crops biannually. On the first occasion of such a ceasefire, the arrangement was almost entirely to the benefit of the Muslim forces, who were under attack from Croat forces and facing famine. Again, a piece of evidence that might have escaped your attention, so I'll read from it. It's 7D1191, the 92 bis witness statement of Shemso Muminović. At that meeting, I explained to Vinko Pandurović the difficult situation we were then facing due to lack of food. At that time, Muslim forces were engaged in a conflict with the Croat Defence Council. For that reason, the delivery of food supplies from Tuzla was difficult. A food supply crisis appeared imminent, affecting both civilians and army personnel in that area. I suggested a truce to Vinko Pandurović in the duration of 1 month to allow the spring harvest preparations to be made. By truce, it was understood that there would be no shelling of inhabited or uninhabited areas or roads. In other words, that there would be a complete ceasefire. In response to my proposal, Vinko Pandurović said that he did not have his command's approval, but that regardless, he would agree to the proposed truce on his own responsibility. He said, "Shemso, the truce is in effect from the day after tomorrow at noon. Let the people work in the fields, whatever may happen to me." In late January of 1993, Pandurović made an arrangement for the daily passage of Muslims at or near Kamenetsa. The arrangement allowed for those who were trapped by combat to pass safely. During Operation Match 1 in June of 1993, Pandurović's unit, through the efficiency of its actions, trapped several thousand Muslim forces at Ustipraca. They had advanced far more rapidly than their neighbouring units, and because of the dominance of the position they had taken, the Muslim forces were completely at their mercy. Notwithstanding this, and completely without the authority of his superior command, Pandurović allowed all soldiers, civilians, vehicles and arms to leave the area, in quotations, without a single bullet being fired. This was done at the initiative of Pandurović by direct communication with the opposing commander, Ahmed Sedic. These last two incidents will be returned to in greater detail in due course, as the prosecution brief has confused the two episodes in its submissions. The unanimous experience of those who worked with Pandurović as a commander was that his treatment of and his instructions as to the treatment of prisoners of war was at all times consistent with the Geneva Conventions. Upon his return to Zvornik on the 15th of July 1995, his orders that prisoners were to be kept alive at all costs were well known. Symbolically, when on the morning of the 16th of July, a Muslim communications officer was interrogated by his chief of staff, that man had his wounds treated, was fed and released safe and sound. Moreover, on the 18th of July, a group of 7 to 10 Muslim teenagers was at the 4th Battalion command post.
Thank you for reading slowly.
Occasions.
Again, Mr. Haynes, my attention has been drawn to ask you to read more slowly, please.
I'm sorry. Pandurović immediately told these men to stop digging, ordered Dragan Jokic to guide them through the minefield to the safe Muslim side, and contacted Shemso Muminović and told him he was sending the teenagers back to him. He was to call Pandurović back and let him know if they had arrived safe and sound. In due course, he did so. It is well documented that a large number of prisoners arrived at the Batkovici camp in the latter half of July 1995. They came from the Zvornik Brigade detention facilities. Moreover, it is plain from the evidence that Pandurović was active in securing their transfer to that place for exchange. During the course of this trial, a number of witnesses have expressed their view as to the effect which Pandurović's absence had during the crucial periods of the indictment upon unfolding events. Perhaps most graphically, Lazar Ristic said, "I'm still not clear why this was done in Zvornik when our commander was absent, and in a way it so happened that they came through the command of our battalion where the commander was also absent. If they had been there, I believe that things would not have happened the way they did." As an example of the command culture within the Zvornik Brigade, it should be remembered that Lazar Ristic, who spoke elsewhere in his evidence of the guiding example of Pandurović's command, withdrew his men from Arahavats when he discovered a murder operation was in process. As was developed in our brief, it is not merely Pandurović's absence from Zvornik during the critical days of July and September of 1995 which is important. Of equal, if not greater importance, is his absence from the taking of crucial decisions. For example, the decision to transfer prisoners from Bratinats to Zvornik for execution, taken on the evening of the 13th of July, and the decision to disinter and rebury bodies buried in the Zvornik area, taken sometime in late August or early September of 1995. Pandurović's absence from Zvornik at those times and from those decision-making processes was accidental and enforced. It was, however, well known to those involved in taking those decisions. Now, I have taken some little time in outlining this evidence to you, because in our submission it goes directly to 6 issues raised in the prosecution brief. It goes firstly to the question of the credibility of Vinko Pandurović as a witness. It goes secondly to counter any suggestion that this is a man who has ethnic bias. It goes thirdly to illustrate the reality of the command climate that existed within the Zvornik Brigade. It goes fourthly to illustrate the way in which he and those subordinate to him habitually treated prisoners of war. It goes fifthly to the question of how you weigh up the evidence concerning his actions in allowing the column to pass on the 16th of July. And it goes lastly to the question of genocidal intent, given the way in which the prosecution have put its case in that regard. We submit that if you give proper weight to the evidence I've outlined in this short section of these oral arguments, you will reject many or all of the prosecution's submissions about Pandurović in those 6 regards. Now, to switch horses for just a moment, I would like to take just a few moments to analyse the purpose of this exercise. This is, in truth, a sweeping up operation. I have been putting the same case for 3 years, as I think everybody recognises. I'm not going to repeat it all today. However, I wish to make a few observations. Pandurović's case was plain from the cross-examination of prosecution witnesses. The themes we have developed could not have been clearer. Pandurović appeared as a witness on his own 65 ter list, filed in April of 2008. His was the last case, and accordingly, by the time he gave evidence, the areas where he contradicted other parties' cases had completely crystallized. The prosecution case does not meet Vinko Pandurović's case, nor even comment upon it in a number of very material respects. To give some of the starkest examples where the prosecution does not comment, either in its final brief or its closing submissions upon the case for Vinko Pandurović, I'll pick just 4. 1, that Pandurović had no effective control of the Zvornik Brigade between the 4th and the 15th of July. This is an evidential, not a legal consideration, and you'll find not one submission in the prosecution brief addressed to that issue. 2, the legal status of the Yugoslav National Army Brigade rules, a theme we developed in great detail both during evidence and in our submissions. Not one comment. 3, the allegation that Pandurović returned to Zvornik on the morning of the 12th of July, something which PW168 was effectively commissioned to say during his evidence here, but not a theme developed in the prosecution brief at all. And 4, the biggest gaping absence of all, not a word about the zone of responsibility on which so much of the prosecution's case hinges. We were laughed at, frankly, for causing PW168 to sit there with enormous maps and join the dots and explain that the prosecution's zone of responsibility theory was nonsense. to find not one word addressed to that issue in the prosecution brief is startlingly surprising, to say the least. We submit boldly that where the prosecution does not deal with issues such as this, raised by the defence throughout the trial and in its brief, to which the prosecution has the right to reply in its oral arguments, as a matter of natural justice, those issues simply have to be resolved in the favour of the defendant or the accused. But matters don't stop there. In opening this case, I specifically challenged the prosecution and all parties to put their case to Vinko Pandurović when he gave evidence. I made a bit of a joke about it at the time, aligning the practice of putting your case to my Englishness. But it's not an English thing. It's in the rules of this tribunal. It's Rule 90H2, and I don't imagine you need reminding of that. But what Rule 90H2 says is, in the cross-examination of a witness who is able to give evidence relevant to the case for the cross-examining party, counsel shall put to that witness the nature of the case for the party for whom that counsel appears, which is in contradiction of the evidence given by the witness. You may think that in the case of an accused giving evidence on his own behalf, the rule has particularly sound reasons. Firstly, that you, the trial chamber, are entitled to see the reaction of an accused to an accusation put to him. Secondly, you're entitled to see his answer. And thirdly, everybody accused of criminal behaviour is entitled to have an opportunity to answer the accusation, which is a central part of the prosecution's case. The prosecution itself agrees that the rule is important and criticises, I think, most of us for failures at some stage during the case to challenge one thing or another with odd witnesses. But given especially that Pandurović gave evidence as the last substantial witness in the defence case, and that, as the prosecution have acknowledged, there was no stopwatch on cross-examination, the issues were absolutely crystallised. There is simply no excuse for failing to put to him significant aspects of the prosecution case. We have analysed closely the allegations now made in the prosecution's final brief and contrasted them with the cross-examination of Vinko Pandurović. The prosecution's final brief is simply replete with assertions that were not put to Pandurović in cross-examination. We simply don't have the time to list them all, but where relevant as we go through the evidence, we will highlight assertions in the final brief not put to Pandurović in cross-examination. For present purposes, and simply to highlight the evil in this, I'll illustrate it to you with 3 examples. The first, in paragraph 1537 of the prosecution's brief, the prosecution avers that The performance of the reburial operation on the 27th of September is also consistent with the Zvornik Brigade's use of an unusually large amount of D2 diesel on that date, 3,870 litres, without any description in the daily combat report of legitimate engineering works in the Zvornik Brigade zone of responsibility. This is indeed an apparently compelling point, and one which might suggest that the reburial operation was in full swing on the 27th of September and that Pandurović could not have failed to know about it. However, the document upon which this assertion is based bears a little closer analysis. And I'm not going to call much into e-court during the course of these submissions, but I will call this. It's 7D681. And we'll need to look at paragraph 6, please. Thank you. Paragraph 6, as you'll see, records in standard pro forma terms consumption, and every regular combat report has that at paragraph 6. Let us all agree that 3,800 litres is a lot of diesel to consume in one day. Indeed, it's probably far more than 10 digging machines operating all day could consume. But let's look at paragraph 6 a little more closely. It seems that on that day, diesel was not the only commodity that was being excessively used. If 3,800 litres of diesel is a lot, 12,600 7.62 millimetre rounds is the sort of amount of rate of ordnance discharge you'd have expected on the Somme in 1914. It's massive. 1,000 12.7 millimetre rounds, 320 30 millimetre rounds, 20 122 millimetre shells, 10 130 millimetre shells. We submit that that level of use of fuel and ammunition cannot possibly reflect the use of materials on the 27th of September. So what does it mean? The answer is, I don't know. But if this document had been put to Pandurović when he gave evidence, and it had been suggested to him that this amount of fuel had been used for reburials on that day, he might have been able to explain it. He might, for example, have said that sometimes under paragraph 6, the brigade told the Corps Command what it needed. If this document had been shown to PW168, he might have been able to say that this fuel and ammunition related to the fuel and ammunition required by the 2nd Drinsky Brigade, which left for the Krajina the day before the 26th of September. If this document had been put to Sreten Milosevic, the Assistant Commander for Logistics responsible for such matters, he might have offered yet another explanation, perhaps that the amounts were what the brigade had in stock. But this document was shown to nobody by the prosecution. It was simply used as the basis for a submission in their final brief. And we submit that the inference they require you to make or invite you to make in the circumstances is simply impermissible. A second example of a matter not being put. In paragraphs 1340 to 1343 of the prosecution brief, the prosecution makes apparently 4 assertions. 1, that members of the Drina Wolves were in Potochari. 2, that those members of the Drina Wolves were part of Tactical Group 1. 3, that they were under the command of Vinko Pandurović. And 4, that they would have reported back to him what they saw in Potochari. Let's clear this out at the outset. Not one of those propositions was put to Pandurović when he gave evidence. Not one. Had they been, who knows what he might have said? He might have said, I took a roll call of my men on the 12th of July and they were all there. So these people can't have been from Tactical Group 1. He might have said that Kirstic had asked him for 2 or 3 men to be at his disposal on the morning of the 12th of July in Potochari, and these were them. But we'll never know, because it was never put. The evidence in the case is that the Drina Wolves were a unit comprising about 360 men. You'll get that from P382. The evidence is absolutely clear and unchallenged. They were a Drina Corps unit under the direct command on the 12th of July of General Zhivanović. In July of 1995, various elements of the unit were deployed in the Sarajevo theatre, see footnote 567 of our brief, and with Tactical Group 1. About 120 of them were part of Tactical Group 1. By necessary inference, a number of them were not deployed at all on the 12th of July. There simply is no evidence that, even if there were odd members of the Drina Wolves in Potochari on the 12th, that they were under Pandurović's command, or that they were the Drina Wolves that were part of Tactical Group 1. Under the principle that the senior officer present is in command of a mixed unit, then Mladić must have been in command of what was going on at Potochari, or Kirstic at worst. As to the suggestion that the Drina Wolves were in Potochari, in our submission, it doesn't make any sense. You don't send your elite fighting unit to take part in crowd control. The units that were in Potochari were security officers and police units, not fighting units. Self-evidently, Pandurović wasn't in Potochari himself, so how could they get their orders from him if he wasn't there? Moreover, there is virtually nobody who is not on some piece of film or still photograph. Potochari was filmed from a number of sources and perspectives, and had there been any Drina Wolves members, they would have to have been on films or photographs. Again, the failure to put this suggestion or these suggestions to Pandurović simply makes it impossible for you to draw the inference adverse to him that these men were Drina Wolves, were from his unit, were under his command, and would have reported to him. It's a complete false theory. The third suggestion, which I'm raised by way of an example, appears in paragraph 1337 of the prosecution's final brief. That reads as follows. Pandurović's admission that units under his command, as opposed to the units from the 2nd Romania Brigade or the 1st Birac Brigade, took the features around the town of Srebrenica, and ultimately the town itself, is significant, because the UN's Bravo Company compound and the Muslim population in it were shelled at around noon on the 11th of July, injuring several people. Popović knew that these indiscriminate shelling attacks were occurring and were carried out by the units under his command. This assertion is bordering on the outrageous. Nothing of this was put to Popović. Had it been so, he might have been able to explain that the timings were all wrong, that his units didn't take the surrounding features until much later in the afternoon, that the town by then was empty, that his artillery units had been withdrawn somewhere else, or just simply that it is not true, that he didn't know these things, that units under his command did not shell Compound Bravo. There is simply no basis for even inviting this inference. In the circumstances, and I do not apologise for taking some little time with these three examples, I can't do it with every one of them. But as we go through the evidence, I will be inviting you to the view that where an accused has given evidence on a particular issue and the prosecution fails to challenge it, he is entitled, and the trial chamber is entitled, to regard that as uncontested, and assertions in the final brief by the prosecution on matters which haven't been put to Popović ought simply to be disregarded. Unless that is the consequence on the breach of the rule, there is no point in having the rule at all. The evidence of Vinko Popović stands to be judged by exactly the same standards as that of any other witness. I don't say that to insult the intelligence of professional judges, but he is no more and no less credible by reason of his standing accused on this indictment. In paragraph 1279 of the prosecution's final brief, at the foot of page 362 and going over to page 363, there is an assertion by the prosecution which purports to be supported by legal authority. Whilst the defence accept that the prosecution is perfectly entitled to invite the trial chamber not to believe the accused on some or all of his evidence, to submit that the trial chamber should not do so as a matter of law where it is uncorroborated is not only wholly disingenuous, it's irresponsible and incorrect. It is, of course, the law in many jurisdictions that an accused's evidence against a co-accused needs corroboration. But the decision in Delalich was based on its own particular facts, in particular that the accused concerned who gave evidence had a mental state that was seriously an issue. And to invite you to extend that principle to the lengths that it is suggested in paragraph 1279 is quite wrong. Popović's credibility is for you to judge. You saw him and heard him, and you are able to judge whether his answer on any given issue is both truthful and reliable. And we do invite you to look again with care at his evidence, and in particular the answers he gave in cross-examination in detail. His evidence is substantially consistent with all the other evidence in the case, leaving aside most notably perhaps the evidence of PW 168. It is a central irony of this case that some of those who question his credibility concurrently present cases which necessarily involve them alleging that 8, 10 or 14 witnesses, including their former colleagues and friends, have conspired to lie about them, that documents which implicate them are forged, and that their unwittingly captured radio conversations were either incapable of capture, were mistranscribed, or are now misconstrued. Little wonder that the inconvenient evidence of Pandurović against them is added to their conspiracy theories. Pandurović's evidence is heavily relied upon both by the prosecution and other parties in this case. Listing every footnote would be boring, but we invite you to note how frequently his evidence is said to be truthful in different parts of both the OTP and other defence briefs. Pandurović's evidence involved giving details of events which he was not compelled to do by the prosecution case and which might have been taken to be incriminating. To give you a few examples, that soldiers under his command were responsible for the taking of UN observation posts, that he met and spoke to General Kirstich on a number of occasions not proved as part of the prosecution's case, that he learnt of the reburial operation shortly after his return to the Zvornik Brigade in late September. These, we say, supplement and support his general credibility. Please also remind yourselves of the points we made in our final brief as to his credibility about his stance on intercepts, contemporaneous documents, and the general conduct of his case. Paragraph 1279 of the prosecution brief, after misrepresenting the law as we have submitted on the treatment of the accused evidence, goes on to list a series of what I will call areas of dispute in the case between the prosecution and Pandurović, which it terms deliberate falsehoods. The defence cautions strongly against the approach advocated by the prosecution. The trial chamber, of course, knows that these are the points where the prosecution and the defence disagree. That does not make them deliberate falsehoods. These are the issues for you to decide. We reiterate the point that by giving his evidence, the prosecution's burden of proving their case and at the same time disproving his evidence is the harder. It is not a deliberate lie to say you disagree with the prosecution case. Now, an extraordinary amount of time has been devoted by the prosecution in its final brief to 1993. What relevance those passages and further submissions made the other day by Mr. McCloskey have is unclear. At paragraph 1281 of its final brief, the prosecution state that its case does not depend on Pandurović's role in the VRS campaign in 1993. It goes on to say, however, Pandurović spent a significant amount of time testifying about his participation in these events, misrepresenting his role and putting forward a sanitized and misleading version of events. It concludes by saying that the material set forth in paragraphs 1282 to 1312 demonstrate his lack of credibility as a witness, as well as his knowledge and intent with respect to the charged JCEs. On the face of it, the only issue all this material could go to, it not being part of the prosecution case against Pandurović, is to his credibility. However, we're not naive. Directive 4 and the Spring Offensive has always been at the heart of the prosecution's case. And to suggest that Pandurović would not have been cross-examined about it had he not raised it first is unworthy of a straightforward prosecutor. Apart from anything else, Pandurović's role in Kamenitsa and Konjević-Polje was first put to a witness in June 2007 by the prosecution, and raised in detail with Milenko Yevgevich 2 months before he testified. We will now briefly address those allegations in this part of the prosecution's brief. Paragraphs 1285 to 1288 discusses the issue of Kamenetsa. Kamenetsa was not part of Pandorović's case from the beginning. You can see that from the 65 TER summaries served in his case. No reference was made to it in the opening of his case, and certainly at no time has either he or I described him as the hero of Kamenetsa. The evidence about Kamenetsa came out as a result of the prosecution's cross-examination of Milenko Yevgevich at T29718, which the defence then tidied up in re-examination by putting into evidence the regular combat report 7D1006. This was a month before Pandorović commenced to give evidence. The matter having been raised in that way, it was inevitable that Pandorović would deal with it in his own evidence and explain what happened. Kamenetsa has been fundamentally misunderstood by the prosecution. This was not the passing of a column, such as took place, for example, in Balkovica. This was an arrangement for a daily passage along a safe corridor. There is abundant evidence that at the time of this operation, Kamenetsa itself was uninhabited and had been for some time. And you can find that at T12803, the evidence of Miodrag Dragutinovic, and T30799, the evidence of Vinko Pandorović. Read chronologically, the problems with the passage of lost people across a combat zone first came to Vinko Pandorović's attention on the 30th of January 1993, and you can see that from the document put to him, P4233. As a result of that, a radio announcement was made, and he announced directly to those who wished to cross the combat zone that they could do so between certain hours of the day. You will get that from P4229 and 7D1006, the regular combat report for the 1st of February. You will note that that document was dispatched at 11:40 in the morning. At 9 o'clock that night, General Jovanovic sent a report from the Corps to the main staff. He announced that he had taken the decision to create a safe passage. That, in fairness, was put to Pandorović when he gave evidence. It wasn't a document that he had written, but he came up with the obvious explanation that he reported to General Jovanovic what he had done, and General Jovanovic then took upon the decision for himself. The chronology makes that perfectly logical. By contrast, the incident at Ustipraca 5 months later has been part of the defence case from the very outset, and you will see that from our 65 TER list. The episode which Pandorović relied upon in his evidence as illustrating an identical situation to that he faced at Balkovica was the safe passage allowed there. The prosecution's final brief about the events of 1993, you will find not one word about Ustipratsa. It has simply been ignored. And the defence submit that it has deliberately ignored Ustipratsa and deliberately sought to confuse you by confusing that with the episode of Kamenetsa, which it raised and pursued. It cannot be an accident that the former is referred to so often and the latter not addressed at all. That is because we submit that the prosecution is fully aware that Pandurovic's behaviour on that occasion is a highly relevant and pertinent consideration in your concluding how to determine his actions at Balkovica. Paragraphs 1289 to 1297 deal with allegations that in the early spring or perhaps late winter of 1993, Pandurović was responsible for shelling Muslim civilians. We make 4 brief points. Firstly, every document referred to in those paragraphs references mixed military and civilian targets. P409.70, referenced by Pandurović in his own evidence, deals with the legality of mixed military and civilian targets and attacks upon them. Thirdly, the recording of these events accurately stands to Pandurovic's credit, not to his demerit. And fourthly, the fact that the Drina Corps removed references to civilians from its own reports is frankly irrelevant when considering Pandurovic's intentions or credibility. At paragraph 1295, an episode at Konjević Polje is raised. We would point again simply to 4 matters. The reference in the report in paragraph 1295 is to civilians being caught in the fire. There is an obvious inference from that that civilians were not the target of the fire. Secondly, it is not a proper inference to draw that a unit under the control of Pandurović fired 2 isolated shells after 15:30 in the afternoon. 3. The report 5D1323, relied upon by the prosecution, is dated the 15th of September 1993, 8 months after the incident described. The entire document describes military operations between January and August 1993, without any specification as to dates, there is no evidence that it is referring therein to the incident of the 12th of February, covered by this incident and this passage in the prosecution's brief. And fourthly, in spite of his own evidence, the evidence discloses that once contacted, the shelling did stop. Paragraphs 1298 to 1306 of the prosecution's brief deal with allegations relating to the burning of Muslim villages. We submit that the suggestion that Pandurovic's troops burned houses is based on the most tenuous evidence imaginable. He has described in great detail the military campaign that he participated in during this period. He has denied that his units burned houses or destroyed mosques. The evidence that someone else reported to General Jovanovic that houses were burning on his particular axis of attack, and that the Zvornik Brigade cleared away an already destroyed mosque 1 year after the event, doesn't get close to surmounting that evidential obstacle. There is no evidence of the destruction of habitat in any areas where Pandurovic was principally involved. Kamenitsa, Konjevic-Polje self-evidently, since he was active in preventing it, Ustipracha, Visegrad, Zeleny Yada, Živkovo Brdo, Rajna, Bojna, all the areas where you have heard he carried out combat operations. There is no evidence of the burning of any habitat. And don't you think there would have been some evidence if those things had happened? As to the relevance of these events, over and above a challenge to his credibility, we submit that the prosecution position is illogical. Just because an accused has the temerity to explain his involvement in events he would undoubtedly be cross-examined about, doesn't make them relevant to establishing his participation in one or both of the alleged JCEs. The obvious corollary would be, if he'd stayed silent about these matters, they wouldn't be relevant, and that can't be correct. I confess to this day, I am still not clear where it is that I will find the alleged illegal purpose of Krivaya 95. It has been variously suggested to exist in the 6 strategic goals of May 1992, Directive 4 from November 1992, Directive 7, Drina Corps Operational Directive 7.2, and the combat order itself. Okay. I must be going very fast. In our submission, it is unthinkable that a court would determine the individual criminal responsibility of a soldier, professional or otherwise, by reference to the political doctrine or strategic objectives of his native country, especially those espoused at the start of ethnic conflict or at the height of the violence between two communities. To do so would come preciously close to finding that all Serbs had and continued to have throughout the duration of the war the common intent to commit genocide and/or crimes against humanity. Moreover, to rely upon the utterances of government or strategic command from 1992 ignores all temporal considerations. It is as if 2 years didn't happen. There were no ceasefire agreements, no peace negotiations. The international community was not involved. There were no periods of peace. There were no flagrant breaches of the terms of the agreements by the enemy, which more immediately necessitated the operation with which we are concerned. It also completely ignores the reality of the situation in Bosnia in 1992. The prosecution perennially speaks in its final brief and in its submissions of a brutal campaign in 1993 or a violent VRS campaign. The beginning of this war was violent. We will concede that. But this trial chamber only has the sketchiest details of the combat in Podrinja from the start of the war until the campaign which concerns this trial. The prosecution really only want you to consider one period, one part, and one side of the conflict. They ignore the evidence such as 7D1124, 7D1125, 7D946, 7D968, 7D965, 7D992 and 993, which set out, as it were, the violence which was committed upon the Serbian community by its enemy. Pandurović described his whole war, including all the military operations he took part in. These were classic military combat operations, and he is not charged with any crime against humanity or war crime in relation to them. The problems created by the prosecution's dual goals or twin objective theory lies first, as I have already said, in divining their derivation. Are they derived in 1992 or are they derived from the documents of 1995? We submit that the idea of some overarching objective on which the combat plan was based, taken to its logical conclusion, would mean that quite literally nobody subject to it could act lawfully. If, for example, the determining document is said to be Directive 7, then every Drina Corps soldier going about his daily business would have been doing so with the ancillary intention of making life unbearable for the inhabitants of the enclaves. Imagine this. One day you are manning the lines, doubtless thereby effectively tying down enemy resources. The next, with a stroke of General Militich's pen, you're a party to forcible transfer merely by doing the same thing. The combat order Krivaya 95 does not in fact express more than one objective, we submit. Rather than express the same objective in a number of ways, we suggest 4. 1, separation of the enclaves. 2, reduction of the enclaves to their urban areas. 3, creating conditions for the elimination of the enclaves. 4, I'm sorry, I'm going too fast again. Thank you. The urban area is not defined, but the extent of the military objectives is defined. For example, Tactical Group 1 had to achieve Živkovo Brdo. So if you look at the detailed objectives of the combat order, it would still leave a substantial area easily sufficient for the population to live in. Thus, the prosecution assertion that the objective of reducing the enclave in size was intended to cause a humanitarian disaster and was thus criminal is a false assumption.
Sorry, Mr. Haynes, did you say fourth objective?
I'll have to come back to that. Thank you. Also, the phrase elimination of the enclave, paragraph 4, is ambiguous, and it is not safe to assume that it meant forcible transfer of the population rather than neutralisation of the 28th Division as a military force. Apart from anything else, it doesn't make sense to say reduce in size and create conditions for its elimination if your objective is so to constrict it that everybody would have no choice but to leave then. It is plain that what is meant is to create a new perimeter which is easier to police and stop excursions by the ABIH into Serbian territory, because necessarily the smaller the perimeter, the less soldiers you need to guard it. Thus you would eliminate the enclave as a military feature, not as a place for people to live. We're bound to observe, in relation to the case of the dual goals, firstly, that the way in which the prosecution's case is put in this trial is inconsistent with the way it was put in Blagojevich and Krstić. See Krstić at para 136 and, Krstić para 119 and Blagojevich para 136. Secondly, the VRS force wasn't sufficient to achieve the illegal objective as alleged. Even the prosecution contend that any one of a number of factors occurring would have stopped the illegal objective from being achieved. Nasser Oric being there, the 28th Division putting up a proper fight, clear skies on the 11th of July allowing NATO to drop bombs on Serbian forces, etc. Thirdly, when Pandurovic departed to the operation, he expected nothing to come of it, and that, we say, is proof of his intentions. Fourthly, when he achieved his objective under Krivaya 95, namely the taking of Živkovo Brdo, he and his forces withdrew, and his evidence is that he expected to go home. And lastly, but not leastly, he was a tactical commander whose concerns were local, and insofar as the orders from above were concerned, were specific. In relation to the dual goals of Krivaya 95, the trial chamber has visibly been concerned with where you draw the line, and it received some assistance on that point from Mr. McCloskey the other day. It is interesting to see whether their theory as to that bears out any careful scrutiny of the way in which this case is now put. And the trial chamber might briefly like to consider how the indictment is framed in deciding where you draw the line between those who are participating in the joint criminal enterprise forcibly to transfer the population and those who are not. The prosecution contend at paragraph 1620 of its final brief that Pandurovic was in a precisely similar position to the tactical commanders of other brigades, in particular Mirko Trivic and Svetozar Andrić. And certainly it is true all of them took part in Krivaya 95, and all of them are brigade commanders. All of them commanded units which attacked Muslim forces at Srebrenica. All of them entered Srebrenica town. All of them were present at a meeting at the headquarters of the Bratinats Brigade, whenever that took place, and all of them marched towards Žepa. Trivić and Andrić took part in the assault on Žepa between the 14th and the 24th of July. Trivić and Andrić had units in Žepa throughout that period, and they also, if you have regard to Trivic's diary P4309, took part in the loading of civilians onto buses. Self-evidently, neither of them have been indicted. And more importantly, if you have regard to paragraph 97 of the indictment, the only brigade commanders listing as participating in a JCE are Pandurović and Blagojević. Moreover, in paragraph 98 of the indictment, Trivic's unit, the Romania Brigade, is not even listed as a participating unit in the implementation of the JCEs. When Trivić testified, the prosecution was specifically asked by His Honour Judge Kwon at the start of his testimony on the 18th of May 2007 whether a Rule 90 warning should be given to him. And the prosecution said in clear terms, one was not necessary. That's at T11793. So the prosecution's position is necessarily that, in particular, Trivić, and by necessary inference, Andrić, are guilty of no criminal behaviour. They were not part, apparently, of a joint criminal enterprise forcibly to transfer. Neither had the intention for forcible transfer, neither aided and abetted forcible transfer. In short, neither is guilty of any criminal behaviour at all. Given their identical roles and their presence at the alleged crucial meeting in Bratinats, where is the line of distinction now between Pandurović and Blagojević and the other two? The answer in our submission is perfectly simple. Criminal liability in this case has got nothing whatsoever to do with knowledge of the legality or otherwise of the Krivaya 95 operation. It has nothing to do with whether you had seen, read or considered Directive 7. Nothing to do with whether your units encountered Dutchbat on the outside of one or other of the enclaves. Nothing to do with whether you saw or participated in the evacuation of the civilians. The sole determining factor as to whether you, as a brigade commander, are deemed criminally liable for participation in the JCE to forcibly transfer civilians is whether prisoners ultimately die in the municipality where your command post was based. And that may be a convenient moment to take a break.
Thank you, Mr. Haynes. We'll have a 25-minute break starting from now. Thank you.
All rise. Veuillez vous lever.